Women's rights have simply acted as a veil to distract away from the true intentions of progressive activists. The socialist revolution in America depended on two things: a breakdown of the family and women voting for progressives, both of which they have been very successful at doing.
But it wasn't his land, so there really wasn't anything he could do about it. Unless, of course, he could control what other people could build. In 1964, Walt personally reached out to the city council and asked that they consider imposing height limits. His argument was that Disney was committed to helping grow the city of Anaheim through Disneyland's success. However, that success was dependent on Disneyland remaining a high-quality experience people would want to visit. So in a way, it was in these businesses' best interest to help maintain the illusion and the magic that Disneyland created in order to keep tourism healthy in the region.
Hello, locale, and welcome back. I see you brought friends. Up until this point, I have been a bit abstract, a bit distant from the material on which I was talking. But for the fourth video in my series on the philosophical perspective of the hero's journey I hold, things will be a bit more personal. When I started this little series, I was speaking about socialism and Marxism, but upon reaching the abyss of Campbell's study into the hero's journey monomyth, there just wasn't any way to speak about that. Because, from my perspective and understanding, the abyss is never without, but rather within. We create our own abysses, whether it be through our ignorance of the unknown and attempting to apply the known to it, or through the theories and ideologies we hold so tight to our hearts. We create it with our obsession. We create it with the narratives we tell ourselves, and we create it by building that hatred for ourselves within ourselves. In short, we dig our own holes. Sometimes we do it because we just haven't left home before, and the vastness of the unknown shows us just how foolish we really are. But more often than not, we dig ourselves these holes because of what we want from others, whether it be acceptance, or support, or love, or not to cause trouble, or because the resources they provide to us, whether those be financial, social, for security, or even for what we might perceive as liberty. But with time, that abyss we've dug within our hearts becomes so deep that none can even reach us. We cry out to those standing around the hole, but eventually there is nothing they can do for us. It'd be easy to think we've gotten past the abyss when we see nothing but its walls around, because it's impossible to see anything but the walls we have created for ourselves. There is no long view of the world. There is only that with which we are obsessed. And as we focus on that obsession, we dig ourselves deeper and deeper. But we have to step past the abyss or hole metaphor to move forward, because there's no way we can dig ourselves out of a hole. Instead, we have to look for a long view of the world. We have to look for other perspectives on the matter. And one perspective I've been finding fascinating recently is that of how Walt Disney was able to create such a precisely magical experience within Disneyland through lines of sight.
Speaking of hiding, another important element to designing a Disney weenie is knowing where to place it so that it doesn't interrupt the sight lines from other areas of the park. When you're in Tomorrowland, it's important that you can't see Big Thunder because it just wouldn't make any sense. You're in Tomorrowland. Unless, of course, you can design a Disney weenie to have two different themes from two different angles. With a little bit of care and planning, what can look like a creepy Hollywood hotel from one perspective is just another building in the Moroccan skyline from another.
Have you ever been to Disneyland? As you travel through the park, it is impossible to be anywhere else but the fictional world being recreated for you in that section of the park. There's just nothing else to see. When you are in Main Street, USA, you can only see that which looks like Main Street, USA. And when you're in Fantasyland, you don't see anything but Fantasyland. This was entirely by design, to the point where Walt Disney petitioned the city of Anaheim to limit the height of buildings near Disneyland, as well as put up balloons at the heights of buildings to be constructed, so he could be sure that, inside the park, the buildings, trees, and the enormous set pieces such as Splash Mountain and Sleeping Beauty's castle would serve to block out your line of sight and not let anything take you away from the fantasy he had created. And despite the hodgepodge mess of design elements within each themed area of Disneyland, the path on which you walk almost never lets you see those conflicting design elements. You are constantly immersed within the exact fantastical world Walt Disney wanted you to see. The abyss in which we find ourselves, to me, is indistinguishable from Walt Disney's fantasy, carefully crafted and arranged and cultivated to be exactly what we expect to see, even if those expectations themselves only exist from the movies we watch, the people with whom we interact, the choices we have made. If you know where to look, though, the illusion is almost immediately broken. In Main Street, USA, for example, most of the second and third stories on the buildings are not tall enough for a person to stand in. Using that forced perspective, Main Street, USA looks like it stretches nearly forever. And likewise, it can take nearly 15 minutes to walk from Fantasyland to Frontierland within the park. But for employees, the route is barely 10 steps, because while guests follow the most bizarre winding paths through the park and back to Sleeping Beauty's castle, before they're able to go to the next area, those two areas are actually rather close to each other, separated only by an unassuming curved tunnel between two buildings.
Of course, if care isn't taken to sightlines and design, as was the case when Michael Eisner was placing the at the time new Swan and Dolphin resorts, you end up with a visual inconsistency that breaks the theme.
Have you ever wondered why, in the depths of despair, others seem to speak about solving the problem as if it's just that simple? How could it possibly be that easy, we might tell ourselves, with everything wrong right in my face? Well, that's just the forced perspective we've provided for ourselves. The buildings aren't actually that tall, and if we stop, clear our minds of the anger, the hatred, the self-loathing, we might just see that unassuming simple tunnel, and the Disney princess who's using it for quick access to her next stop on her work rotation. It's easy to build up around ourselves things to block out what we might not have wanted to see before, but we have to see it. By taking the narrative that feels best in the moment and focusing wholeheartedly on that, leaving no room for any other perspective but the one that makes us feel like we should be in the happiest place on earth, we hide ourselves from the infinite possibilities we haven't tried, haven't considered, which can lead us past our problem to whatever comes next. After all, we can't stay in Disneyland forever. Eventually the park and the illusion is broken by the announcements of the park closing in 15 minutes. Likewise, you can't actually stay in the abyss forever. Eventually everything you had is lost, everything you knew is gone, and all that is left is hatred, anger, pain, and self-loathing. And at that point, it's not even an abyss at all. It's just a dead-end job, or a dead marriage, or a deadlocked disagreement, or any other number of euphemisms which reference death. Death is certainly there, nipping at our heels. So what do? Do we cry out for others to save us? It won't work. The rope they have doesn't look long enough to us due to the forced perspective. Do we wallow in our self-pity? That won't work either. Eventually we will drive away anyone willing to listen, not just with the pity of ourselves, but the blame we place on everyone around us. What about group therapy or any number of quote-unquote self-help books? Well, they rapidly become a waste of money because we'll convince ourselves it would never work. I'm no master, no source of sagely wisdom. I'm just a person with a microphone. But the only option I've found is as simple as it is infuriatingly difficult. Just let it go and be yourself. You can't control every aspect of the world, and why would you want to? So just let what comes come, and let what goes go. Try to move forward in your life in a different direction, one you have no idea of, or even one you fear more than any other. Ignore that screaming in the back of your mind that this is the opposite of what you should be doing, because we trained our instincts to point us in the wrong direction, and the only way to fix that is to prove it wrong. Be yourself, not the self you think everyone wants to see, and not the self you've built up to match their expectations, but the subtle, simple you that has always existed, even if you hated it. Who knows, you might even find that you like yourself.
Bill Ayers gave women a set of tasks based on his realization of the power of an uprising of women could bring to the progressive cause. He said, quote, "Our goal is the development of feminism, which genuinely determines, safeguards, and defends the collective interests of women, and which points in the direction of revolution. We need to build a revolutionary feminism. Women are at the intersection of a crisis and the will to survive."
This one's for my father, and for that crazy look in his eye. No, this one's for my mother, that she might be a child and cry. No, this one's for my brother, for showing me there's things that money can't buy. And no, this one's for my sister, teaching me to always keep my weapons by my side. And I ain't gonna sit and let this world go by.